This week's episode of Cosmic Shenanigans is brought to you by the National University's online MFA program. Since 2005, they've helped working adults learn the craft of creative writing. There is no residency requirement, and genre fiction is welcome and accepted at this school. Horror, science fiction, fantasy, young adult. You can work with faculty like Lee Thomas and John Coyne. They focus in fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, or screenwriting. And the screenwriting faculty are all active Hollywood professionals. Join an alumni network of over 1,000 graduates. Get the idea in your head, out of your head, and onto the page. National University is an accredited, not-for-profit university. Explore more at www.nu.edu.
Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary San Giovanni!
Folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary San Giovanni, and as always, I'm up to shenanigans once again of cosmic proportions. In the intro to the Cosmic Horror Collection Awaiting Strange Gods, S.T. Joshi says of author Darrell Schweitzer, "What Schweitzer has done, in effect, is to fuse Lovecraftian cosmicism with the contemporary focus on intimate human relations and the complexities of human psychology." As he goes on to note, this was something contradictory to Lovecraft's decentralization of humanity in his tales, but as we have discussed in past episodes, it's something which seems to be redefining the cosmic horror subgenre. What we really get in this book, notes Joshi, is tales which draw on, quote, deeper, more disturbing emotions, the emotions of regret, envy, sorrow, fear, and resentment, to produce that most unusual of hybrids, the Lovecraftian tale with profound emotional resonance. Although that type of hybrid is admittedly a divergence from Lovecraft's vision, I believe it's a pretty good way to describe the direction of modern cosmic horror. Humanity may still ultimately be insignificant in the grand scheme of the greater universe, but the human psychological need to reframe for significance through emotion and human connection serves as a sharper contrast to the indifferent forces of nature. The story we're going to talk about this week is from this collection. It's called The Clockwork King, The Queen of Glass, and The Man with 100 Knives. This is by Darrell Schweitzer. What we have in this story is a protagonist, a main character, Henry, who is, like many Lovecraftian, you can't really call them heroes, because I don't know that hero is necessarily the right word, but protagonist is definitely a fitting title here. This is Henry's story, and it's kind of Henry's story. He's a loner, he's a lifelong bachelor, and he admits early on in the story that he needs direction. We get the impression from not so much from what he says, but what he doesn't say, that he perhaps had no real father figure in his life growing up, and what he was looking for was somebody to give him guidance, to give him a certain degree of meaning. So if we look at this in Lovecraftian terms, or cosmic horror terms, he is pursuing something almost to the point of obsession, almost to the point of detriment to his own character, and that seems to be fairly common. It's definitely common in Lovecraft's tales, but it's also a fairly common element of cosmic horror in general, that pursuit of knowledge, that pursuit of understanding of the world, and the greater significance of the world, which is usually at detriment to the person pursuing that knowledge. We also have the character of Reggie. Reggie is kind of Henry's Randolph Carter, maybe. Or maybe his Pickman. You know, there's sort of a nod to Pickman's model in this. The idea is that Henry looks up to Reggie. Henry finds, as he mentions throughout the story, Reggie is the Faustus to his Wagner, the sort of central figure, the Sherlock Holmes to his Watson, maybe. Okay, this idea of a sidekick. One of the things I want to bring up about their relationship, which I find kind of interesting, and this is a nod to Schweitzer's subtlety and his deftness with language in this particular story, is that, again, a lot of the story is what is not said around the words that are said. If you can wrap your brain around that. It's a lot of the things that are implied but not said. Their relationship is one of those things. He goes to the point of protesting too much, in a way, that that there's no homosexual romantic feelings between the two of them, that there's no love feelings, that it was really more of a hero worship, a bromance, if you will, that sort of a hero worship, kind of situation, a sort of master and servant kind of situation. But throughout the story, he keeps making sure that you're aware that no, it was never like that, it was never sexual, it was never romantic, to the point where you start to think that maybe, Henry's lifelong bachelorhood had to do with the fact that maybe Reggie always was the object of his affection, his extreme love. And I like that Schweitzer approaches this kind of thing in a way that I think even Lovecraft might approve of. Lovecraft was very asexual as a person, from what I gather from correspondences and things that literary critics have said, that as a person he was kind of uncomfortable with intimate social, not so much friendships. He was very good with correspondence with friends and things like that, but when it came to overt public displays of affection, sexuality, that kind of thing, he eschewed that for, focusing on other things. That's not to say, and this is arguable, I think a lot of literary critics argue this, that's not to say that there was no sexuality in the stories, but it was often perversions of sexuality, almost grotesque perversions of sexuality in the stories, which I think were meant for horrific effect, as opposed to really examining the intimate relationships that people have. One of the things, as I mentioned early on, is that there's an emotional resonance here, that there is regret, there is envy, there's sorrow, and I think that there's this idea that this love might be unrequited, so much so that he buries it, which is kind of sad in and of itself. Now, what I love about the structure of this story is that the surrealism here is perfectly cosmic horror. Okay? The narrator is perhaps an unreliable one. In fact, the narrator tells you he's an unreliable narrator, that he's confused between reality and fantasy, dream and waking life, lies and truths. And again, he says some of this story is a lie. And I think it's because he refuses psychologically to embrace certain things. And again, I think he sees the world the way he needs to and not the way it is. And a lot of times that is the psychological component, especially of modern cosmic horror. This idea of seeing reality the way you need to and not necessarily the way it really is. Now, he's told by Reggie, okay, who basically moves in and out of his life for decades, that there is an alternate dimension, the Kingdom of Black Glass. That this Kingdom of Black Glass is actually the real world, and that all the worlds of light, as he puts it, worlds like ours, dimensions like ours, are just dreams, and they're easily shattered if the Castle of Black Glass, the Clockwork King, and his consort the Glass Queen should ever fall. Now, Henry describes the world as, quote, sort of a cross between Alice in Wonderland and Lord of the Rings on acid, with a substantial sadomasochistic element added. It's reminiscent of a Lovecraftian dreamland story, too, with significant blurring between fantasy and reality, dream and waking. Okay? And I think it's important to understand the setting, because, again, in a lot of cosmic horror, from prior to Lovecraft straight up through to modern cosmic horror, and including a good portion of Lovecraft's works himself, like in The Mountains of Madness, the setting is as important as any main character. The setting is, a lot of times, the wellspring of the cosmic horror in and of itself. It's personified, it's nature personified in a lot of cases. And this world, again, I think that's something maybe that Schweitzer was looking at in this particular story, is that this world becomes more significant than the world that we've come to know. That this Black Glass Kingdom is where any hope for humanity to have any kind of significance or achieve or accomplish anything of importance is done here. And that the dreams that we have in between, the dreams of Walmarts and driving to work and reading the newspaper, that this is the time of insignificance. He makes several references to Poe. I mean, there are references throughout to, I guess, pop geek culture, which I think is kind of cool. But he makes several references to Poe in terms of, a lot of cosmic horror, a lot of Lovecraftian horror deals with insanity. We've covered that in other episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans. A lot of Poe's work dealt with insanity too. Now, Poe's work generally is too character-centric and, too much of a microcosm to really be considered cosmic horror. But there is that element of insanity there. And particularly, there's the reference to the Telltale Heart, where in the beginning, the narrator of the Telltale Heart says, very dreadfully nervous I was and am, but how will you say that I am mad? And he goes on to explain that he knows that although he maybe has these sort of nervous tics, he's not crazy because he knows what he's doing. In this story, I think that reference shows the deterioration of Henry knowing what he's doing, of understanding what is happening around him, and ultimately of accepting that reality is a kind of madness. What we get, I think, a lot of, particularly this Poe quote, I think is in reference to the end, which is actually a series of endings, which I believe is somewhere between these three endings is where the truth of the story actually is, where the reality of what happens to this character actually is. There are alternate dimensions. I mean, this is definitely a cosmic horror story where clearly this Kingdom of Black Glass is an alternate dimension, and that there are multiple dimensions. But that this, as I mentioned, this Kingdom of Black Glass is the real one, the reality, the waking world one. Time does not work the same in this world. And I think that's important to understand all of these three endings, because I believe he says, well, this happened. And he said, no, that's a lie, this happened. No, that's a lie. I'm avoiding those two endings because this is what really happened. And honestly, the way that it's worded, the way that this story is put together, I think all three endings happened in succession, because time doesn't move linearly in this world or in that one. And I think that's the point, is that he is mad in a way. He is insane. His pursuit of his need for the approval of Reggie has driven him to accept these hiccups in reality, this that he's taken on the mantle of what has become so important to Reggie, that Reggie in this other world is a great hero, a great defender of the kingdom, and that where it never could quite gel that he could be like Reggie in this world, he could fight alongside him in the other world. The problem is that Henry is not a great hero. He's not a great hero in this world, and he's not a great hero in the other world, and he gets hurt. He gets badly, badly hurt every time he goes into this other world. But the idea is that whatever happens to him, it's all true, and it's all lies. And I think that is another element, particularly of modern cosmic horror, that I think is important to note, and is maybe not always done as deftly or as clearly as in this particular story. This idea that our emotions, when we do reframe significance from being, insignificant life forms in the grand scheme of the universe that doesn't care about us, to reframing everything so that despite our tininess, there are still things that take up the universe for us. There are still things that are so important that they become the universe for us. When we do that, when we reframe things through emotion, because we need to, that it does warp reality. And emotion does that. Emotion does warp reality. And I think that's an element of cosmic horror that's important to note, because it is done very well in this particular story. This idea that the intensity of his emotions do end up warping reality. Now, one of the strongest elements of cosmic horror in this story, too, that is also worth noting, is in whether madness or some version of reality has rendered people and their sometimes tendency to let life pass them by without accomplishing anything of note in this world, whether that's kind of it's a kind of horror in and of itself. Either, and I think that's another thing that's worth looking at too, from a very human perspective, is that, we've often talked about things in cosmic horror which are worse than death. And for somebody like Henry, to whom insignificance is kind of a given, I think that really what Darrell Schweitzer does here is that he has all the elements of cosmic horror, but he just rearranges them and uses them in different ways. And this idea of insignificance is a kind of horror in and of itself. Whereas in Lovecraft, the horror of being insignificant was that there were these ginormously cosmic entities that didn't care about us, that could ultimately prove our destruction because we were powerless against them. Schweitzer kind of internalizes that. He kind of goes in the opposite direction and says that one of the things that destroys us from the inside out is believing that we've let life pass us by, and that anything important we ever could have done, we missed the chance. That our life is a series of missed opportunities. And we follow Henry from college to till he's in his 70s, and the only place where he was ever significant was in the kingdom of Black Glass, and only for a brief time. And again, I think that the way that this story ends is beautiful. It's beautiful and tragic and horrific in a way, because again, like a lot of Lovecraftian heroes, if you want to call them that, there's this giving in to the inevitable. There's a giving in to a person's fate and a person's true nature. And in this particular story, the true nature is that, heroism is shades of gray. It's shades of gray, and bravery is shades of gray, and significance is shades of gray, because time and reality are shades of gray. And I think that's where, as Joshi says, a lot of this emotion is infused around elements of cosmic horror. And much like, as we just said, I think the emotion around the elements of cosmic horror warps them. But it warps them in these fascinating ways. So we get these stories of people who recognize the global or universal insignificance of humanity while